The greatest enemy of progress is not failure, but the illusion of success. These words, which could have come from the mind of Sigmund Freud himself, highlight a disturbing reality about human psychology. We are often our own worst saboteurs. Self-sabotage, that silent destroyer of potential, operates beneath the surface of consciousness, a shadow force that Freud identified as part of our psychological makeup, yet remains largely unacknowledged in our daily lives. The human psyche, according to Freudian theory, exists in a constant state of conflict, torn between the primitive desires of the ID, the moral constraints of the superego, and the mediating force of the ego. This internal battlefield becomes the genesis of our self-destructive tendencies, creating patterns that silently undermine our conscious goals and aspirations. The mechanisms of self-sabotage are intricate and deeply embedded in our psychological structure, operating with such subtlety that we rarely recognize them until their damage is complete. A phenomenon Freud explored through his concept of resistance in psychoanalysis, where patients unconsciously fought against their own healing. Imagine standing at the precipice of success, a promotion within reach, a relationship turning serious, or a personal goal nearly achieved, only to engage in behaviors that guarantee failure, procrastination, unnecessary conflicts, or self-doubt that paralyzes action. The same pattern applies to our deepest desires for fulfillment and happiness. We claim to want them while simultaneously engaging in behaviors that ensure they remain unattainable. The psychological foundation of self-sabotage can be traced to our earliest experiences and the development of our personality structures. Freud's theory of psychosexual development suggests that unresolved conflicts during our formative years create neuroses that manifest as self-defeating behaviors in adulthood. These early experiences shape our self-concept and establish the blueprint for how we relate to success, failure, pleasure, and pain throughout our lives. The unconscious mind, that vast repository of repressed thoughts, traumas, and desires, exerts tremendous influence over our actions without our awareness or consent. A central tenet of Freudian psychology that explains why logical understanding alone rarely solves the problem of self-sabotage. For Freud, the unconscious operates according to the pleasure principle rather than the reality principle, seeking immediate gratification without concern for long-term consequences or social appropriateness. This dynamic creates a powerful undercurrent that can pull us away from our conscious goals despite our best intentions. On a deeper level, the repetition compulsion, Freud's concept that we unconsciously repeat traumatic experiences in an attempt to master them, drives much of our self-sabotaging behavior. When childhood experiences teach us that we are unworthy of success or happiness, we unconsciously recreate situations that confirm these beliefs, perpetuating cycles of failure and disappointment, not because we desire suffering, but because these patterns feel familiar and therefore paradoxically safe. The concept of secondary gain further illuminates why we might undermine our own success. Failure often carries hidden benefits such as avoiding new responsibilities, receiving sympathy, or confirming negative self-beliefs that, while painful, provide a stable sense of identity. These unconscious payoffs create a powerful incentive structure that can override our conscious desires for growth and achievement, keeping us trapped in self-defeating patterns despite their obvious costs. The fear of success, while counterintuitive, represents another Freudian insight into self-sabotage. Success brings change, and change, regardless of its positive nature, triggers anxiety and resistance. Success also invites scrutiny and raises expectations, creating performance pressure that many find unbearable. Freud's understanding of defense mechanisms reveals how we protect ourselves from this anxiety through self-sabotage, unconsciously choosing the familiar pain of failure over the unknown threats that success might bring. The superego, Freud's concept of our internalized moral authority, plays a critical role in self-sabotage through unconscious guilt and the need for self-punishment. When we harbor beliefs that we don't deserve success or happiness, often stemming from childhood experiences where achievement triggered parental jealousy or withdrawal of affection, we unconsciously ensure our failure to maintain psychological equilibrium. This guilt becomes particularly destructive when it operates outside our awareness, creating a perpetual cycle of self-punishment disguised as bad luck or external circumstances. The Oedipus complex, one of Freud's most controversial theories, provides additional insight into self-sabotage. The unconscious competition with parental figures can lead to success inhibition as a form of conflict resolution. Surpassing a parent's achievements may trigger unconscious guilt and fears of symbolic patricide or matricide, leading to self-limitation as a form of loyalty to family of origin. This dynamic illustrates how our earliest attachments continue to influence our relationship with success and failure throughout adulthood, often in ways that directly contradict our conscious desires and intentions. The psychological concept of transference, projecting feelings from past relationships onto present ones, further complicates our path to success and fulfillment. When authority figures in our present trigger unconscious associations with critical parents or other significant figures from our past, we may sabotage professional relationships or opportunities as a form of unconscious rebellion or self-protection. These hidden connections between past and present create obstacles that seem external, but actually originate within our own psychological structure. The human desire for consistency, while not explicitly Freudian, aligns with his theory of the ego's need for stability. We tend to act in ways that confirm our existing self-concept, even when that self-concept is negative. This need for psychological consistency can lead us to reject opportunities that contradict our self-image, maintaining a coherent but limiting narrative about who we are and what we deserve. The paradox becomes clear. Our psychological apparatus often values coherence over happiness, preferring the pain of the familiar to the anxiety of the unknown. Freud's concept of ambivalence, holding contradictory feelings toward the same object or goal, further explains the phenomenon of self-sabotage. We might simultaneously desire success and fear it, want intimacy yet dread vulnerability, or seek freedom while clinging to security. These opposing forces create psychological paralysis or self-defeating behaviors as the unconscious mind attempts to resolve the conflict by preventing action altogether. This ambivalence reflects the complex interplay between our various psychological structures and needs, where gratifying one aspect of our personality may threaten another equally important part. The anxiety that accompanies potential change functions as a powerful catalyst for self-sabotage, as Freud's theory of neurotic anxiety suggests that we often fear our own impulses and their potential consequences. This anxiety leads to repression and symptom formation. In the case of self-sabotage, the symptom becomes the destruction of our own opportunities. The ego, attempting to manage this anxiety, may choose the certainty of failure over the unpredictability of success, sacrificing growth for security in a misguided attempt at self-protection. Freud's discovery of the death drive, thanatos, provides perhaps his darkest insight into self-destructive behavior. This concept suggests that alongside our life-affirming instincts exists an equally powerful tendency toward dissolution and self-destruction. While controversial even within psychoanalytic circles, the death drive offers a framework for understanding the most persistent and damaging forms of self-sabotage, where the psyche seems bent on its own undoing despite all rational incentives toward self-preservation and growth. The process of projection, Attributing our own unacceptable thoughts or impulses to others creates external obstacles that reflect internal conflicts. When we unconsciously disown our ambition, we may perceive others as excessively competitive or threatening. When we reject our own aggressive impulses, we might see hostility where none exists, creating self-fulfilling prophecies that justify our failure. These projections shape our perception of reality in ways that validate our existing limitations, making self-sabotage appear as a necessary response to external threats rather than an internal psychological process. The psychological mechanism of identification with the aggressor further illuminates why we might adopt self-destructive patterns. By internalizing the critical or dismissive attitudes of important figures from our past, we become our own oppressors. This internalization transforms external criticism into self-criticism, creating an inner voice that undermines confidence and initiative from within. The harsh superego becomes a portable prison that follows us regardless of our external circumstances, ensuring that even in the absence of actual critics, we continue to experience the same psychological limitations and self-doubt. The concept of resistance, central to Freudian psychoanalysis, manifests powerfully in our struggle against positive change. Even when consciously desiring improvement, unconscious forces fight to maintain the status quo as change threatens, establish defense mechanisms, and psychological equilibria. This resistance operates through rationalization, forgetting, acting out, and various forms of self-interference that protect the psyche from the anxiety of transformation. The familiar, even when painful, provides a sense of mastery and predictability that the unfamiliar, however promising, cannot initially offer. Freud's understanding of symbolism reveals how self-sabotage can serve as a form of symbolic communication. Through our self-defeating behaviors, we may be expressing conflicts, needs, or traumas that cannot be articulated directly. These symbolic enactments represent attempts to resolve unconscious conflicts through action rather than insight, explaining why logical understanding alone rarely changes self-sabotaging patterns. The behavior itself becomes a language expressing what remains unacknowledged in consciousness, requiring interpretation rather than mere willpower to change. The phenomenon of negative therapeutic reaction, where patients worsen as they approach recovery, mirrors the pattern of self-sabotage at the moment of impending success. Freud attributed this paradoxical response to unconscious guilt and the need for punishment, revealing how psychological improvement itself can trigger anxiety and resistance. This dynamic explains why many people abandon diets just as they show. Results: sabotage relationships as they deepen or undermine career opportunities at the moment of advancement. Progress itself becomes threatening to unconscious equilibrium. The process of working through these self-destructive tendencies requires more than mere awareness. It demands the emotional processing and integration that Freud called working through. This process involves repeatedly confronting unconscious patterns and their historical origins until they lose their power over present behavior. Unlike cognitive understanding, which can happen in an instant, working through unfolds gradually as the emotional charge of past experiences diminishes and new patterns of relating to oneself and others become possible. The concept of sublimation offers a constructive alternative to self-sabotage, redirecting potentially destructive energies into socially valuable and personally fulfilling pursuits. Through sublimation, the same psychic forces that might otherwise fuel self-defeat can power creative, intellectual, or humanitarian achievements. This transformation represents the highest form of psychological adaptation in Freud's theory, suggesting that our self-sabotaging tendencies, properly understood and channeled, might become sources of our greatest contributions rather than our most painful limitations. Modern neuropsychology has validated many of Freud's insights, revealing that much of our decision-making occurs in brain regions outside conscious awareness. These findings support his fundamental claim that conscious intentions represent only a fraction of the forces governing our behavior. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and impulse control, can be overridden by the limbic system's emotional responses, particularly under stress, a neurological explanation for why we often act against our own interests despite knowing better. The biochemistry of habit formation further explains the persistence of self-sabotaging patterns. Neural pathways strengthened through repetition create default responses that require significant effort and awareness to change. Attachment theory, building on Freudian foundations, demonstrates how early relationships create internal working models that guide our expectations and behaviors in adult relationships. Insecure attachment patterns, anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, can manifest as self-sabotage in intimate relationships, career pursuits, and personal growth efforts. These attachment styles, formed before conscious memory yet influencing lifelong behavior patterns, exemplify how early experiences create the template for later self-limitation, creating a blueprint for self-sabotage that feels intrinsic to our identity. The intergenerational transmission of trauma, while extending beyond Freud's original work, aligns with his understanding of how unconscious content shapes behavior. Research now confirms that parental trauma can influence offspring's stress responses and psychological development, suggesting that some self-sabotaging patterns may originate in experiences that preceded our birth, a sobering reminder of how deeply embedded these tendencies can be. Recognizing the complexity of self-sabotage invites a compassionate rather than judgmental approach to our own self-defeating behaviors. Freud's harsh truth ultimately reveals not personal weakness but the extraordinary complexity of the human psyche, where conscious intentions compete with unconscious needs formed during our most vulnerable developmental periods. Self-awareness becomes the first step toward liberation from these patterns, as bringing unconscious motives into consciousness removes their automatic power over behavior. This awareness must extend beyond intellectual understanding to include emotional recognition of the historical origins of our self-limiting patterns and the valid needs they once served. The path beyond self-sabotage requires integrating the fragmented aspects of self that Freud described, acknowledging the primitive desires of the id without being controlled by them, developing a more balanced superego that guides rather than punishes, and strengthening the ego's capacity to mediate between these forces and external reality. Through this integration, we begin to align our unconscious motivations with our conscious goals, reducing the internal conflict that fuels self-defeating patterns. The ultimate challenge in overcoming self-sabotage lies in confronting our fear of becoming who we truly are, a process that Jung, building on Freudian foundations, called individuation. This journey toward psychological wholeness requires facing the discomfort of authenticity and the responsibility of living from our genuine capacities rather than our comfortable limitations. The question remains, are you willing to confront the unconscious forces that have limited your life, or will you continue to sabotage your own potential? The harsh truth that Freud offers is that freedom from self-sabotage requires facing the disowned parts of yourself, a process that promises greater wholeness but guarantees discomfort as you challenge the very psychological structures that have defined your existence. Yet in this confrontation lies the possibility of genuine transformation, not through denial of your complexity, but through its full acceptance and integration.